What's up everyone, my name is Ryan and welcome to the lab. Today we're going to follow up last week's video where we talked about what goes into making a video. Today we're going to focus on shooting, specifically your camera and your camera settings. After you watch this video and practice what you learn in it, your films are going to stand out. Your films are going to stand out because your story, your environment, and your equipment are going to work together to dictate how you shoot everything. Your films are going to instantly stand out. Before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos in this series. Thanks, appreciate it. Okay, so I've already mentioned that the first thing you need to know is understanding the settings in your camera. The cameras that I use are the Canon EOS R and the Canon EOS M50. They are similar, but the M50 is the more affordable version. The Amazon link will be in the description for the M50 and the EOS R. The three camera settings that we're going to talk about today are your exposure, your frame rate, and your white balance. Now, when you use a camera to start practicing these techniques with, don't think, oh, what camera do I need to buy? Think about, what's the most recent camera that I have used? That's gonna be the camera that you're gonna master these settings on. And when I say master, I don't mean you're gonna master everything about that camera. You're gonna master the settings required for your particular application. Now, the first topic is exposure. Your exposure can be described as how bright or dark the video appears. It's the sensor's relative response to light, and it can be manipulated one of three ways: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Keep in mind that every camera has auto exposure. It will automatically adjust to the environment. However, it is computer controlled inside of your camera. It gives you the least amount of control over the look of your video. And it's basically gonna make your video quality look like the general public's. That's not the look we're going for, is it? And if you're shooting with a phone, you have limited access to some of these settings. There are apps available, and I will leave in the description a link to an app for iPhone and an app that works with Android devices. First, we're going to talk about controlling your exposure using aperture. Aperture affects your exposure by controlling the amount of ambient light that reaches the sensor, while at the same time controlling the depth of field. It's measured in f-stops, and they describe the diameter of the opening of the aperture. If you need a shallower depth of field, you would go to a low aperture number like 1.4 or 1.8. One situation where you would require a shallower depth of field is when you're shooting a subject that is in an environment that does not add any more value to the scene. So because of that, you can focus solely on the subject and sort of blur out everything else. If you need a broader or deeper depth of field, you would go to a higher aperture number like f7.1 or f8. Shutter speed is the second way that we can control the brightness of the video, and it does this by controlling the frequency of the light that is hitting the sensor. Additionally, it controls your motion blur, and it is measured in fractions of a second. You would use a low shutter speed when you want to increase the blur of objects or subjects that are in motion. You would increase the shutter speed when you need to capture moments that would benefit from less blur. The bottom number of your shutter speed needs to be double the frame rate that you're shooting in. It's what's most present in films that we watch today. Frame rate will be discussed later in this video, so stay tuned. By the way, if you're understanding this exposure thing, let me know in the card above. Okay. The last component is ISO. Controls the brightness or the exposure in the video by increasing or decreasing the sensitivity of your camera sensor to light. But it also can control how much grain or noise is present in your video. Indoors, you usually have to increase your ISO. It is because there's not a ton of light indoors, and unless you have some pretty serious lighting, then you will need to turn up the sensitivity in order to get the look that you're going for. ISO is usually the fastest way to brighten up your video. I never prefer noise in my videos, but I use a high ISO when my aperture and shutter speed are fixed and I don't have any access to light. When you are outdoors, you can use lower ISO values. Now, you will hear filmmakers tell you that you want to shoot at the lowest ISO possible. I disagree. There are not many instances where I would recommend shooting at an ISO of 100. In many cases, you can underexpose your image, and people will tell you that, well, if you underexpose, you can always raise the shadows, but it's not a fun process. You want to expose correctly every time. Actually, we're gonna go over that like right now, but I gotta change locations because I'm getting a little stuffy in here. Let's take a ride. Yeah. If you have a meter on your camera that looks like this one, you can probably access it through your info settings in your menu or something like that. But if you have that, the leftmost side of that meter is actually where your shadows are gonna get crushed. The rightmost side of that meter is where your highlights are gonna lose information and be blown out. The middle portion of the graph is the information. So you wanna keep that in the center and evenly distribute it across. Now, the cameras that most people can afford may always have some pieces that are blown out if you're gonna get the most available information. A good rule of thumb is to make sure that 90 to 95% of your information is there. If there is an overexposed part or if there's an underexposed part on your graph, on your meter, make sure there's a small piece that's barely touching it. Now, I used to underexpose at all costs because I wanted my films to look like they look in the movies. When I got ready to edit my videos and they were too dark, no matter how bright I made the picture, it wouldn't clear up. It always felt hazy and I couldn't get the color right. If you don't have the meters, the next best way to expose properly is using your viewfinder or using your LCD screen if your camera has one. When you go to shoot your scene, you're gonna look for the darkest part and make it visible. Then you look for the brightest object in your scene. If it's overexposed, meaning if it's pure white, lower your exposure just a little bit until 5 to 10% of the entire frame is overexposed. 5% is ideal. If it's impossible to expose properly, meaning you cannot get enough light on your subject without overexposing more than 10% of your scene, it's time to think about changing up your scene. Next thing we're gonna discuss is frame rate. So, two common frame rates that I use are 24 frames per second or 60 frames per second. These settings are mostly important when you are looking to edit your video. If you're not planning on editing your video, shoot at whatever frame rate that you want. I think I need to take another walk. Oh, shoot. When you're watching any sort of film, it's at 24 frames a second. I think news is at 30 frames per second and sports are at 60 frames per second. The significance of that is that when you play 60 frames a second, at 60 frames a second, it looks way more smooth. What I do when I'm shooting 60 frames per second is I take it into the editor in a 24 frame per second timeline and I slow it down by 40%, which effectively makes that 60 frame per second footage 24 frame per second footage, but it's smooth and it's slow and it's silky, and I like it. Design your scene around what you want. So if you want a film that's natural, it's got a lot of dialogue in it, you want to film at 24 frames per second. Or if you have a scene that you need to establish, slow motion looks really good, then you want to shoot that in 60 frames per second. Let's take another walk while I talk to you about white balance. Somebody wants to hang out. Gypsy, we're going to tell them about white balance. White balance. You smell good. So your white balance is what Your white balance is what helps your camera to correctly display the colors. Your camera usually has automatic white balance. It works fairly well. Most cameras have a way for you to select a button that corresponds to what sort of lighting condition you're experiencing. Auto white balance should get you straight. If not, the buttons can get you there. If you want to get super technical with the numbers specifically, YouTube is your friend. Here's what we went over. Exposing in a way to where you can collect the most information across your camera sensor with minimal over or under exposure. Remember, expose to where a minimum of 5 to 10% of your frame is overexposed. Make sure that your shutter speed is double your frame rate, and make sure you have the proper white balance, which means either putting your white balance on auto, knowing what shade of light you are under and selecting that particular setting in your camera, or setting the color temperature to the correct Kelvin number. If you use these best practices to shoot your story, you're gonna create very easy to edit footage, and it's gonna be silky, and it's gonna be dramatic, and it's gonna be film-like quality. So that concludes the video. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you go and use your camera and get started with those settings. Next week's video, we're gonna talk about framing and composition. We're gonna talk about lighting, and we're gonna talk about audio. Stay tuned, subscribe, hit the bell notification. Leave a comment. I hope you learned something today. I love y'all. Peace.